everything that was said this morning. The first consideration is that us as Africans, we have today rely on ourselves. We have to use the positive experiences of one another. We also have to work together in collaboration, in synergy. Should you be reminded that the building of our respective countries after colonization, this construction, this building of our nations was not based on generosity. Far from that. The colonizers did not build the majority of our countries, of our nations, for us. They did that in order to safeguard their interests. At the War College, we were constantly reminded that this world is governed by the interests of the wealthy and the powerful. And the aspiration of the weak is to become powerful, and we're therefore in a power struggle, and we have to understand this. And all these elements feed the different geopolitical interests. Having given this context, what are the factors that lead to the emergence and the use of private military companies or foreign military bases? We are today in a global world where everything moves very fast, and we can say that African security is at a crossroads. Today, Africa is at the heart of major security transformation, which will not only redefine the power relations on the continent, but the power relation that this continent will have with others. Peter Singer said earlier concerning these private military companies that they were companies that provide professional military services in the strategic areas such as training, protection, and commitment on the field, engaging themselves on the field. These companies operate on the global market to sell security. It's almost like we're trading. Furthermore, Deborah said that private military companies are non-state actors that sell their security services and their security and defense services to governments, private people, individuals, and anyone who would request them. They mostly operate in a vacuum in terms of regulatory framework. One of these shortcomings that they used to operate in are the security weaknesses that some of our countries experience. So these non-state actors are called in order to fill this gap. But they also have their own agenda. When we call on them, no matter the reason, they also have their own agenda. And we also have to take into account these geopolitical challenges. So these are some of the elements that I wanted to share with you. There are other factors, of course, but this is what I wanted to say for now.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And I wanted to touch, Dr. Ashraf, if I may go with you next. The General has brought out very nicely the profit motive that drives PMCs, the internal security deficits that drive the customers to bring in the PMCs or the foreign bases. Help us understand the security deficits, the pressures that kind of lead to this decision. And then perhaps, if you will, are private military contractors, like all sorts of other consultants, lawyers included, but please don't tell the lawyers that I told you about this at the security conference, people who never solve the problem that they've come to solve, because if they solve it, what then will they do? Dr. Ashraf?
Thank you very much. And ladies and gentlemen, let me just say, first of all, it's a great pleasure to once again be here. And I can't put into words my feelings this morning when I heard the speech by the President and by other dignitaries that have developed this, what was a national security conference, into an international one. And particularly about the consistently well thought out wisdom, that's the only word I can think right now, that is coming out from the African leaders on this. I feel hugely inspired and, of course, humbled to be here to share some minor points in comparison. And so I think it behoves us all to answer our questions within the framework that was so brilliantly articulated this morning. And one of the headlines that's been quoted several times, and quite rightly, is that security cannot be outsourced. If I may just say that that speech was hugely efficiently and powerfully packed, and we need to unpick every single word of that. And the full quotation, and I think it's important to understand this, is that Africa's future, particularly in matters of peace and security, cannot be outsourced. So the whole idea of future, which I think was explained earlier today by several people, is not just hard military security. The link between development, economic, and social security is intrinsically tied with what we traditionally know as security. The other thing that I don't have time to go into, and it's not the right place, but I would urge you please to think about this very carefully, is the President's words where he linked in matters of peace and security. You can have security, but you can't necessarily have peace. And to conflate the two is a very dangerous thing. And we can, of course, explore what he meant by outsourcing. The question for me has been asked, and that is, what are the drivers? Well, the drivers, as research will tell you, and as the General has pointed out to some degree already, one of them is weak military capacity, or it's the belief, you won't see this in research, but I'm adding this, it's the belief in having a weak military capacity. Now, with all due respect to the many African nations and the many African military commanders here, if there is a country in the continent of Africa knows that this is a lie, it is Rwanda. This government came into power, it took on not just an established military, but it took on the might of the French with all their capabilities. And despite all those extra capabilities, they won a very much needed victory. And if you very quickly, you don't have to be a military strategist or a historian, if you very quickly look at all the wars that have been fought since Vietnam till now, fought by hugely powerful military nations, with the deficit between their capability and the people they're fighting being off the scale, yet in every single one, they have lost the war. So I think this idea that you lack a weak military capability is one that needs to be thought about very carefully. Yes, you lack certain services and capabilities that you would want, I think, under the right circumstances, to supplement by bringing in expertise and services from abroad. but you must never, ever allow, and this goes back to another quote that I heard this morning, the dominance, narrative dominance to infect you. The dominant narrative out there is Africa needs help. No, Africa is more than capable of dealing with its own problems if only we believe the things that have been talked about from this platform just today. And of course, others have said things elsewhere. The second point, if I might just come to that, and I won't go further, there's a lot more that can be said about this, and that is that crisis environments, such as, for example, an outbreak of terrorism in West Africa, as happened, and many other instances, make governments panic and outsource military support. And they do so without the relevant safeguards, and they wonder why it's unsuccessful. And again, ask yourself the question, if this company or this nation that we're taking support from, what is their track record? What have they achieved? Have they eliminated terrorism successfully elsewhere? The final point, to supplement these 2 points, if I may, is that it's nothing complicated about the business of choosing appropriate private military companies. Most of us who have children, all of us, I think, who have children, do this without thinking about it. When we put children in the care of a student, of a school or a tutor, we automatically think, am I going to get the right level of education for my child? But much more importantly, we ask ourselves a question subconsciously, is this person going to harm or exploit my children? And even if there's a slight hint, we will not go anywhere near them. It's exactly the same thing. And I speak as somebody who has held contracts for private military companies on behalf of my government. These are just common sense ideas, and these are ideas that you are more than capable of putting into practice if you take the advice given by the President and by His Excellency and many other people who've spoken on this platform to not allow negative narratives to dominate your thinking, but to make decisions, your own decisions, with confidence. I'm sure you can achieve security without the disadvantages involved in PMCs and bases.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Ashraf. I'd like to turn to you, Dr. Deng, regarding the harm and the benefits. Dr. Ashraf has brought out nicely the point of, if we take a child to school, we find out about the school, whether it has the ability to impart the kind of education we want for our child. We expect to have regular exams that show whether the child is making progress. And of course, if there is any risk of harm, we don't take the child to that school, or we remove the child from that school when we learn of that harm. PMCs and foreign bases, using that segue into the risks and benefits. What risks and what benefits are there in your view? How can they be weighed up? And if at a certain point a decision is made that the foreign base, for example, is no longer helpful, has become harmful, can you just tell them, excuse me, please leave? Or does it become more complex than that? Doctor?
Yeah. First, one is really humble and honored to be here. And in fact, one is so happy with the organizers for the choice of the security, as the President mentioned, actually overdue. But importantly, for the choice of having this conference, this great country. This country will continue to inspire us. Will continue to inspire us because they emerge triumphant from the ashes of genocide, but they give us the hope that we can build a better Africa. Because the experience of this country is assuring us, and I think we can learn a lot from there. Maybe the question about the drivers of the this phenomena of the private military companies or security companies, I think it should let us really to redirect our discussion, because the president challenged us about this outsourcing is more about us. How are we handling the security itself? And I think for me, going to internal dynamics, how the state themselves are handling the security. Because the act of outsourcing is indication of a deficit in not only in security, but also in governance. So let me come to the, maybe the question is even larger than that. Are African countries able to control their warfare domain? The land, the air, the space, the cyber, are they in control? Because this is a very important question to ask ourselves, and all of us, we can answer that question, because it's giving us to the year. But the phenomena of the private military companies, or even the security companies, it is, ironically, it is by the choice of the state. These companies are registered. These bases are allowed, are not imposed, but actually allowed by the state. So then the question, and answering the question of the president, then what are really the drivers of this? I will come to that, your question. I think I can identify about 5 of them. One, the persistence of the presence of this phenomena on the continent is a result always prevalent in the countries in conflict, or countries that are actually transition from conflict. Because usually such states, they don't have the capacity to deliver the core functions of a state, and particularly delivering security and safety to the citizen. And becoming necessary for this state to start embarking on these companies in order to fill the gap. And this is by necessity. And I think I will give you an example of my country. I did some work on the non-state actors in my country. Only in 2009, there was only one private security company. By 2024, the number jumped to 130 companies. And you could see clearly the need for them to get this one. In addition to this one, we have a United Nations mission in South Sudan, which is having about 20,000 forces and having Chapter 7. And not only in security, but even the delivery of services, the proliferation of NGOs on the continent. The NGOs are acting like a state on the continent to provide the services. In actual fact, they're supplanting the role of the state on the continent. In my country, the number was around 100 in 2012 of NGOs. Now is around 300 on the country. In addition, now we have even the deployment of the Ugandan People Defense Forces. So you could see clearly this phenomenon is a real one. And it's not in South Sudan, but it's all over. The second one, even in the countries that are stable, there's an increasing level of governance deficit. African states are not delivering security to their citizens. With less motivated security actors, even the security actors becoming a cause of insecurity on the continent. And we have observed it on the continent. And it's really a real challenge, because we are failing to deliver security to our citizens. The third is the type of threat facing Africa, becoming very complex, transnational in nature, actually outpacing the capacity of the state. If we talk today about the cybersecurity and the infrastructure on Africa, definitely the criminal networks and the criminal actors are becoming smarter than the state. And that is a big challenge, one of the drivers. The fourth driver, before the last, it is the weak collective and joint response to the security challenges on the continent. Africa has been talking a lot about the standby forces, but nothing is happening. Our national institutions, the regional institutions, whether it is IGAD or whether it is ECOWAS, are failing the continent to deliver security. And it is very important for us to recognize this one. The one before the last, the erosion of multilateralism and the emergence of transactional leadership and new liberalism on the globe. These are becoming a factor of which I was looking at what is called the doomsday clock. It's actually now moving about 90 minutes away from the midnight, showing that the world is really in danger. The last but not the least, all this cannot happen. It is because of absence of national security strategy on the continent. Because you cannot handle all these things without having a well-designed, people-centered national security strategy that will help you to address this threat. So the choice of whether you have this phenomenon is a choice because you don't have a sense of direction and a policy to guide you. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Doctor. I think that deserves a real round of applause, not the sprinkling. As the panel was being introduced, we have a general, a doctor. I had to find a title for the next panelist, so I'll just call him my brother, Murithi. We're the ones without titles here. My brother, very quickly, on the drivers, the risks and benefits. Perhaps looking, to what extent Dr. Denkwall has properly brought out the irony of it's a sovereign choice, often a sovereign choice to bring in PMCs. It's a crisis of security agents sometimes becoming insecurity agents and thus creating the room for the PMCs. What are the elements that, to your understanding, deal with, external actors, especially when it comes to foreign bases? What choice do the local actors have in terms of trying to speed up the change that we need to see fewer bases, fewer PMCs?
Thank you, Brother David. And just to say, echo my colleagues, it's really very inspiring to be here and to see this very well-organized and very well thought through conference. So a couple of things. By the way, it's also very difficult to come last after such invigorating discussions. The other day I saw the Pope giving his first address, and then he said that it doesn't matter whether people clap at the start. What matters is if people are awake at the end. So I think we have a really challenging task ahead of us. But very quickly, I'll say a couple of things. I think we need to be blunt that what we are discussing is basically corporate mercenarism. I find it very interesting that, and this is curious, that when it's Western or South African, we call them private military companies. When they are geopolitical rivals, they are called mercenaries. And when they're Americans, they're called contractors, which sounds very ascetic. You'd imagine they're going to build schools and hospitals, but they're all essentially soldiers of fortune. But we have to be really careful because when discussing this phenomenon, and because abuses occur, because they weaken states, we often are tempted to blame the external actors. But what we heard from the president this morning is very pertinent because very often the demand is coming from within, as we've just heard. And so if you permit me, I'll discuss this quickly through the prism of Sudan. I agree with the gentleman, Khalid, in the morning that we really need to pay more attention to Sudan because it's a staggering crisis, the biggest crisis in the world. But a couple of things. The Horn of Africa, sadly, we're not strangers to conflict. But war is often a rural phenomenon. Very few wars occur in the capital or even in cities. Every war is bad, but these wars, I think as we are seeing in Sudan, have a particularly egregious impact. A couple of things. One is that when war breaks out in the capital, you lose your middle class within a week. You know, we saw in Sudan, the educated classes, the most talented, all of them, the business classes, they left within days. That makes the work of reconstruction much harder. The second thing is that the capital is usually the place of refuge. That's the place where people flee to. The degree of displacement has been particularly high because now, you know, there's nowhere to flee to, nowhere is safe. And that has been very problematic. And then thirdly, war, usually the logic of war is to acquire the power of the state. But when you fight in the capital, you're destroying the essence of the state. And again, that makes the work of reconstruction much harder. The logic of war usually is you fight in the rural areas, come to the capital and take control. An aide of the former Prime Minister Meles Zenawi of Ethiopia used to say that he was astonished that when they came into Addis, there had been no fighting there, everything was intact, they were able to pay civil servant salaries within a month. Now in Sudan, you have destroyed the heart of the country, and therefore, you know, getting back from that is very difficult. I say all this because the last time all these factors combined with each other was in Somalia. So I very much agree with all the speakers in the morning that we are still in a phase of prevention, because it could get worse and we really need to move more quickly. So to bring it to our topic today, another distinct thing about Sudan is that it's a war of the future. It's being fought with tools that our soldiers were never prepared for, that the state cannot operate, as Dr. Luka just mentioned. And so, for example, when the Sudanese army took Khartoum, the assumption, if you're following the logic of war in the past, was that the war was about to hit a turning point, negotiations would follow, and possibly it would peter down. Instead, it has escalated. Why? Because similar to Ukraine, we are seeing both sides deploying drones that can, strategic drones. Basically, we've always had drones in this region, but now you're seeing the capacity to fire drones over 1,200 kilometers away with extraordinary accuracy. Our soldiers cannot operate those equipment. What is happening? We hear all manner of reports. I'm not asserting it as fact. It's just public information. You're hearing about Iranians and Russians and Ukrainians and Emiratis and all manner of actors, Colombians, as we had, because this is basically a war of the future. And this is a really worrying phenomenon, and it shows you the risks when you open the door to this. So just to say that it's the most essential thing we need to do on the continent is avoid wars of choice. Sudan is a war of choice. Ambassador Kimani in the morning spoke about incentives. The generals had a choice not to find a way to share power, to find a way to, collaborate with the civilians, but they chose war. When you open the door, it's very hard to close it. And Sudan now, given the sophistication of the equipment and the people operating it, the multiplicity of external actors, and especially the so-called middle powers that are becoming direct contestants, it'll be very hard to pull back. So the main point I would like to make is that we really need to avoid the choice of going to war.
Thank you very much. I'd like to take it back to General Traore, if I may. My brother here has just talked about wars of choice. We often hear about wars reported in terms of natural resources. So sometimes when it's talked about, the reports we hear about, for example, Sudan, also have close links to gold. And we also know that in places where there have been private military contractors, it's often said that they're being paid in natural resources, or that they're getting or are related to companies that get natural resource concessions. Please help us unpack the element of natural resources and their relation to the demand for PMCs, or how they're exacerbating the use of PMCs, and that shortcut in Africa, in your experience, General?
Merci à vous. Il faut dire que de façon globale,
You know, generally speaking,
les conflits de nos jours sont mus par des
today all conflicts are motivated by economic interests.
lorsqu'on va aller aux causes.
That's when you look at it, trying to understand the root causes. Other aspects include the visible part of the iceberg. You know, you're coming to save a struggling country or building this and that, but the forces on this world are about economy, and we need to organize and to fight those root causes. We need to focus on governance and equitable distribution of resources within different nations. And we need to focus more on good governance. Those are the elements that give you avenues of solutions. It was reiterated that there is necessity to come together in that effort. And individually, allow me to say this, we're going straight to failure if we do it individually. But if we come together, if there is synergy in our action, we can fight that problem and solve it.
Thank you very much, General. Dr. Ashraf, do you want to have a go at the issue around natural resources, the profit motive, and maybe for the foreign bases, geopolitical concerns, great power play, logistical corridors, and indeed energy or resource hunger at home for the countries that have these bases?
Well, what you've summed up, if I may say, is the changing world order. What you described is what the world order has been. It's been about exploitation. It's been about maximizing, if you like, a commercial advantage with minimal sustainable return to those with whom we do business. And Africa, I'm afraid, is a classic example where nations that have got their power through exploitation are now set on a worldview that perpetuates this. This is a big issue, and it's an issue that deserves a great deal of thought. Why do we have this situation? And this is not the place, I'm afraid, to do it. But the point I want to make here is this. The very fact that the world order is changing provides an opportunity for Africans to provide an alternative belief and thought model. And we must question the inherited ideas of power and security. Power for the majority of the world's nations, and I'm talking here about the powerful nations in Europe, has been acquired primarily through building up a military capability which then is used to colonize, and that is used to extract wealth at minimal benefit and often with great harm to the people from which it's extracted. And this morning we had an excellent alternative example which was dealt with very swiftly. China had transformed in an unimaginable way its wealth and its capability and its power through an opposite mechanism, because China has suffered from colonialism and imperialism. But China developed its economic capability and has slowly but very efficiently transferred that into military might. It's the reverse of the experience that the former rulers of Africa have had. And with that in mind, we must look at those questions you asked about exploitation, about mineral wealth and so on, in a new light. And it has to be a light where you start with the assumption of a multi-civilizational world order, where every nation and every group of nation has their own vision of how the world should run, what are their values, how do they see power? Do they see power simply as economic and military might, or do they see power in the power of values? And in that regard, and I've said this, I think, in a former version of this conference, I used to point out to the generals for whom I was working in wars, who were struggling to find a solution to, a peaceful solution to the conflict, you will not find better examples of conflict resolution anywhere in the world than you will find in this continent. Of course, everybody knows about South Africa, but Ghana and many other places have produced brilliant models. The model produced here after that traumatic event of 30 years ago is also an exceptionally good one. You won't find a parallel to this elsewhere in the world. So there is phenomenal scope for thought leadership. There's phenomenal scope for shaping the way the world operates, and then for, with confidence, negotiating deals on minerals, negotiating alliances where necessary, and I would warn against them, in a way that is mutually beneficial. And there are people now in the world, and most people, we've talked about the West, or rather I've talked about the West in very negative terms. I've talked about Western state and institutional structures. The people in the West have very good values, and most of them want to have a good world where there's a fair deal. So it is about anchoring and exploiting those opportunities to address those problems afresh. And I think they begin with regional cooperation and with regional deals. And in that regard, I think the move that this country has begun already with its neighbours at the highest levels is one that I believe and I pray will yield huge benefits in the long term, and it will solve much of the problems associated with these tactical issues of extraction of wealth and exploitation of talent.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Dr. Denkwall, earlier today we heard from Victor Gao, and Dr. Ashraf has just kind of alluded to that it's important that we Africans are able to weigh up. We weigh up what we want based on African interests, and use what we want rather than what we need, rather than what we're told we need, as a guide to our development. And I think in your own earlier submission, you also talked about the lack of regulatory or accountability infrastructure, for lack of a better word, around PMCs and foreign bases. They operate in a vacuum. Let's combine those two thoughts and perhaps think about how better to bring about regulatory, democratic accountability for the PMCs. How do you envision Africa being able to weigh up when to use PMCs, for what to use PMCs, when to host foreign bases, what they should be allowed to do and what they ought not to be allowed to do, and when we don't need them? Doctor, give us an idea on how to do this.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think in order to look at the impact of these phenomena on our institutions, one may need to reflect a bit on the great work by the African Union trying to review the 1977 Convention on the Elimination of Mercenaries. I think there's a bit of a confusion between mercenaries and the private military and security And that work is very important. And I think on the continent also there is a very divided opinion whether the private military and security companies are actually beneficial to the continent or not. And that divided opinion is very important to dissect it a bit in order to know. But let me go to the, how do they operate based on my limited work on this security sector, the private sector, the private military companies. In most cases, because these companies are actually contracted on profit-making basis. And they tend to be registered under, usually, the business law. And here you have a business law governing companies to deliver the most sensitive functions of a state, that is provision of security. And here you have a dilemma between a profit or delivering public goods in the best possible ways. And that conflict becoming very apparent. But one thing I observe also, when these companies are registered, they tend to be owned by some security actors. And what it creates the conflict of interest in a sense that because of the condition of these security actors on the continent, you get the retired or some of the people in the security institutions becoming actually the owners of these companies. And that created even weakening further the security institutions. One thing which is very important and is very alarming is affecting the institutions because of these companies. The level of payment is so exorbitant in relation to the pay to the normal soldiers. And you get a very big trafficking, you are better off actually to move to these companies rather than being in the security institutions. So in the long run, if you continue with these companies, you are going to weaken the security institutions. And here the state itself is not availing the resources to the, and because of those ones, because in the long run, it's going to affect the issues, not only the security institutions, but the whole lot of accountability and the, by the way, there's a very good work by the United Nations. United Nations, they have a working group looking at the atrocities and the violation of human rights by these companies. Like what he said, it was astonishing, the level of human rights committed by these companies, becoming almost like mercenaries. And that's why becoming necessary to link the mercenaries with the but by the end of the day, it is our choice. We are the one who actually decided to have these companies. Then the biggest question, are these companies or these foreign bases advancing the national agenda? Are these companies aligned to the national security priorities? Are these companies enhancing a national ownership? Because these are very fundamental questions. You may be having a very good basis on the continent. You may be having many companies. But by the end of the day, the state itself the role of the state is being eroded and supplanted over time. And by the end of the day, you will get the state itself becoming very weaker and weaker and weaker. And that's why on the continent, why there are some countries are having these companies while other countries are not having. You ask Rwanda, for example. Rwanda is another example of where you provided a leadership around the importance of a state to deliver the security and safety. But it is very important, definitely, to involve the market. But it is very important at the same time, by the end of the day, it must be people-centered, and it should actually enhance the safety and security of the citizen. So exactly what the president said around the issue of ownership is really at stake with these companies. Unless the regulations, and I think the good thing now, the African Union, the review itself, is coming with a draft and there's a likelihood they're going to improve on the convention on the missionaries, but to include a clause around injecting the issue of accountability and transparency of these companies so that you can be able to be part of the by the end of the day, whether they're good or bad, it is our choice. But the indications are quite clear. The more we rely on outsourcing, we are weakening our institutions, and we cannot get out of this cycle of being dependent of the external support.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Apparently, the more you use enhancements for strength, the weaker you get. But apparently that's discussed in different conferences, medical conferences, and not one on security. But ironically, PMCs have exactly the same effect. My brother, I want to talk about the alternatives and pathways to self-reliance. Dr. Deng Kwol had started talking about those, but give us your view on what are the alternatives and what are the pathways to self-reliance. To what extent can we use different transnational cooperation in Africa to deal with what we perceive to be the capacity lacks?
Yeah, thanks, David. And just maybe I'll give the example of Sierra Leone, which was one of the first countries that encountered this phenomenon in the 90s. And I think two things. One is that, first of all, to play devil's advocate, I agree very much with Dr. Luca. The problem is the abuses. But the fact is sometimes these groups can be effective. And they're more effective, certainly, than UN peacekeepers. As people have pointed out in the past, a peacekeeper comes in primarily to keep peace, not to enforce it. But they are often deployed to areas where they might risk their lives. But they don't come here to risk their lives. And so it's a very strange phenomenon. But actually, these for-profit companies, because they have set goals and they're paid if they deliver, sometimes they do deliver. In Sierra Leone, they managed to push back the rebels. But then what does it do to the legitimacy of the state? It saps the legitimacy of the state in two ways. One is that in Sierra Leone, as we saw in many other countries today, they decided to pay themselves directly through the mining sector. That undermines the legitimacy of the state indirectly in the eyes of the public, but also directly by taking away resources from the state. Then there's the question of sustainability. They were effective. They pushed them back, but they committed abuses and were forced to leave. The government was overthrown just a couple of months after they left in 1997. So that sustainability issue is really one we should pay attention to. What are the alternatives? I think this is very difficult and complex. Anybody that has worked in the field of security sector reform knows it's very, very difficult and hard work. An army is, in many cases, the soul of a nation. It cannot be imposed externally. But very often, there are internal contradictions within the state that make leaders sometimes wary of having a strong military. And so, for example, I'll be too diplomatic to name directly any country. But essentially, you've seen that a number of heads of state have instead deliberately chosen to create militias and then to rely for regime security on external actors. Why? Because they fear their own shadow and they fear a strong military. So that is very complex to deal with, and I think it's something we need to grapple with. I think the second thing is what was discussed in the morning, solidarity. And I don't just say this because I'm in Kigali, but Rwanda has actually shown in Mozambique and in the Central African Republic that there's an alternative to seeking these external actors, that you can have a disciplined, effective military come in and help with improving security. Certainly they've helped in Mozambique, they've helped in the Central African Republic, but still, that's not enough, It might resolve the problem in the short run, but the answer has to come from within. I'll give one concrete example. If you look at many of the conflicts in the Horn of Africa, a lot of the question is, what is the state? who is a citizen. These are what some have called incomplete states and unfinished nation-building projects. I think we have to confront these questions. For example, is decentralization, where you have a lot of diversity, is that the answer? Some would argue so. In some of the large countries, elsewhere in India, we've seen decentralization has helped. So essentially, you need to have a conversation domestically about the nature of the state, about the nature of citizenship. I think what we need to remember is that these are issues that people elsewhere grappled with and fought wars, 100-year wars. They fought wars which ended up being called world wars to resolve them. We don't need to do that, but it's very hard work, and the answers have to come from within these troubled states.
Super, thank you very much. We have a few minutes. I'd like to open up to a few questions or comments. I think we can take 3 or 4 questions or comments from the audience, and then I'd like our esteemed panelists to give us their last word on this subject. I can see hands up, but I can't see the microphones. We'll take a question from the lady just midway, the beautiful head wrap.
I'm Alice Rusaro Karikezi from the University of Rwanda, Center for Conflict Management. I'm very happy that we are ending that day speaking about 2 myths that perhaps have contributed most of the situations of conflict we have today, namely the shrinking of the states and the fact that the army must be as minimal as possible. And I plead guilty as an academician because this is what we teach our students in the academia, saying that surgical wars exist, so there are wars without risks, including for countries that are big producers of, big manufacturers of weapons, and that the state has to be shrinking. And perhaps ending the day with this reflection is very important to ask ourselves, how can an institution as the army that is responsible for the integrity of a population, linking it with governance that Dr. Kingsley spoke about, how can you divorce from the responsibility of protecting? I know that we bring a lot of questions about human security to distantiate a little bit from security, hard security. But this is, for me, at the heart. After 30 years of teaching, I'm realizing that, no, the states must be capable and is central. No, the army must be strong. So I wanted just to add this comment to my brother, Mr. Mutiri, who has been hinting at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And there was a question just further down, just behind you. Question or comment?
Yeah, thank you. Karen Shelley, I'm from Russia. You know, a couple of short comments. Napoleon's foreign minister, Talleyrand, once said a great thing, that bayonets are a wonderful thing. You can do anything you want with them, but you can't sit on them. Which I guess should mean that the use of a private military company by a particular state should be a purely temporary arrangement. A given state should use that period of time when its security is enhanced by a PMC to build up its own security and armed forces. Then it should pay that company and thank them politely, and say goodbye. And in Sierra Leone, by the way, executive outcomes in Sierra Leone didn't operate all by themselves. They operated in conjunction with British troops, just to make this clear. Another thing, if a government leaves that until too late, all sorts of things will happen, and its own security forces will be quite disappointed. And then it's anyone's guess. Another thing is, you know, it's not just about dollars and cents. When we talk about PMCs and we talk about, using them in African countries, it's political. It's all very political. It's not just money. So if you follow the politics of a particular event in a country and the use of those PMCs, then you could arrive at some very interesting conclusions. Another thing, using PMCs objectively, is it a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, can we draw a conclusion? I don't think there's a definite conclusion to that question, a definite answer. It's circumstantial. Sometimes it is in a good cause, sometimes it isn't. Sierra Leone was mentioned as a good cause, and it worked. Sometimes looking at the way Sudan, where I spent 11 years, has been taken apart, I think that if the government in Khartoum had deployed a decent PMC to crush the RSF when it could, then we wouldn't be in this mess today.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll ask that the microphone be brought to Her Excellency, the Louise Mushikiwabo, at the front. We'll have room for one more, and then I'll bring it in to close the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You know, we sit in a number of fora like this one, talking diplomacy and politics, and it's refreshing to see what else is out there. I have a very simple question. I've been listening intently, wondering for any of the four gentlemen, if the word sovereignty still means what it meant when it was first used. What is sovereignty with the landscape that we have? What is sovereignty when a government kills its own people? What is sovereignty when leaders cannot even circulate, cannot travel in their own country? How does what we have today in a number of places square with this sacred notion of sovereignty, which, by the way, we have to cede a piece of it to belong to some of the multilateral institutions? How does sovereignty fit with everything we've heard this evening? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I'll actually bring it to the panel, because unless there's a burning question, and I can't see one. Excellent. The Russian gentleman, I didn't catch his name, gentleman advised that if you're to use enhancements, you should use them for a limited period of time, otherwise you will stunt your own capacity. He was talking about PMCs. But Her Excellency has brought up a couple of very good questions around sovereignty. Let's use those to, each one of us in a few minutes, couple of minutes, round off this discussion. General, you go first.
Bien, merci. Je voudrais commencer par dire que la souveraineté ne peut se bâtir que sur un fond, un prérequis qui est, je dirais, la bonne gouvernance. C'est-à-dire qu'il faut que ce soit un État normal qui est là pour l'intérêt de son peuple. En ce moment, cette souveraineté peut pleinement s'exercer. Et cela fait appel, bien sûr, dans notre contexte, à un leadership de type nouveau, où on aura des leaders qui sont véritablement dédiés au peuple et que le peuple a voulu là. En ce moment, la question de la souveraineté, ce leader se battra pour les intérêts du peuple. Il ne se battra pas contre son peuple. En ce moment, c'est lui qui s'oppose à ce concept de souveraineté de son peuple. Je voudrais aussi, au-delà de cela, parler d'un aspect qu'on avait évoqué tantôt, ça concerne la force légale doit appartenir toujours à l'État. Ça, c'est le point de vue du principe. Et malheureusement, quand on fait appel, malheureusement ou heureusement, je ne sais pas, mais quand on fait appel à d'autres structures pour exercer cela, ça veut dire qu'il y a des problèmes. Et ces problèmes, il faut leur trouver les réponses en essayant d'aller au fond des choses. Prenons le cas de l'armée. Si une armée est instrumentalisée, tribalisée et plein d'autres facteurs, cette armée ne va pas véritablement se battre pour la cause commune de la nation. Et les autres aussi voient. Et donc, en parlant de ce facteur, il y a un point de faiblesse qui naît déjà à ce niveau. Et souvent, ce type d'armée grandit dans un contexte aussi, parfois de malgouvernance, de gestion économique un peu dévoyée. Et tous ces facteurs nous conduisent, bien sûr, c'est en Afrique qu'on peut compter le plus grand nombre de sociétés militaires privées et de bases militaires. Ceux qui sont suffisamment puissants, ils en ont peut-être quelques-unes, mais c'est dans le contexte africain qu'on voit le plus ce genre d'entités. On doit se poser aussi la question, pourquoi on a autant de bases et autant de...
So many PMCs, so many military bases as well. That means there is a challenge somewhere. So in view of that, we need to find new ways to stop strategic dependency. And I think this is a form of strategic dependency that we need to put an end to try to find solutions politically and to have a strategy for our countries, for African elite. For example, the civil society should also be an effective civil society and not a civil society that just for the sake of civil society. We also need to have some kind of institutional framework for regional and sub-regional security, and also to move forward to integration.
Dr. Ashraf, thank you very much, General. Dr. Ashraf.
Yes, thank you. Speaking very briefly about the question on whether PMCs should be good or considered good or bad. And as you've rightly said, it's a question of context. But in most cases, and it ties in with the question of sovereignty, there are a service that can only be, or should only be used in extremist. Security amongst many of the obligations of a government should be a primary objective, and as far as possible, it should be independent. On the issue of basing, in my opinion, that is an easier one to answer because the advantage-disadvantage balance is very much in favor of disadvantage, and I would not recommend the basing of foreign bases, forces in your country unless it's part of a regional peace bloc. And just as a point of interest, there are about 5 or 6 bases in the United Kingdom where American forces are based. None of them is named as an American base. We call them RAF Lakenheath or RAF Molesworth, where we station 2 Royal Air Force people to give that veneer of sovereignty. So it's an important point. And the question you've asked about sovereignty, Madam, is a very good one, and I think you know better than me, and I'm sure there are people in the audience who know better than me how that question has been tackled from the absolute way that great powers like China want it interpreted as nothing what goes on in our in our country is anybody else's business, to international law, which is saying, yes, except when you contravene certain human rights and other violations when it becomes public business, or rather global business. But there's one area that I want to bring down to from the conceptual to the practical, because that is one of the things that we were required to do, and that is to give a thought to people in this audience that whenever you buy a weapon that is software controlled, a weapon system that is software controlled, you are sacrificing your sovereignty. Let me say that again. Whenever you buy a weapon that is software controlled, you are sacrificing your sovereignty. And if you want more detail, I can bore you to death on it, because I have been involved in this stuff. I think most of you who deal with weapon systems will know exactly what I mean, that any weapon system can now have secret or hidden ways of limiting its operation within a location, within a time, and within other parameters. I want to just finally talk about one point that, again, comes from sovereignty, but it's not an elegant way, so forgive me, I'm not bringing this about elegantly, because I haven't had time to think. But you also should take, sovereignty should stretch to two things. One is doctrine, and the other is threat. And in terms of doctrine, let me very briefly say that a lot of doctrine taught in war colleges, and it was mentioned earlier today, Clausewitz often comes out. Never ever forget that great philosophers like Clausewitz are conditioned by their cultural and historical experience. He is conditioned by the thoughts of Machiavelli, which in turn is based on the Borgia, the horrible excesses of the Borgia popes. He's conditioned by the Enlightenment, which is a peculiar event that occurred in Europe and could only have occurred in that particular context, and modernity that's linked to all of this stuff. So please think very carefully about doctrine. And I distinguish here between strategic doctrine and operational art. And those of you who are going to see the museum tomorrow, I highly recommend looking at that diagram of the operation that led by the RPF that led to the liberation of this country from the genocide. Operational art and planning is a boring topic. I can reassure you of that. But what distinguished that example from all the other examples I've seen, and I've been involved in this for the American Army in a couple of wars, is that planning, that operational art was matched with leadership, incisive, decisive leadership to deliver a result which I think is almost unique. The second point is that be sovereign in terms of threat, and it goes back to what our brother described very eloquently, what has been perceived, what has been pushed in many ways as a threat to you, a neighborly threat, is in the interest of people who want to make a huge amount of money. It's not in your interest, it's not the interest of the neighbors. And eliminating that will not just increase your security, it will save you a lot of time and money. That precious resource that should be spent in the intellectual and spiritual and moral development of your people, that's where power essentially comes from. I would like to say a lot more, but I know the moderator would like me to shut up.
Thank you very much. Dr. Denkwo, closing remarks?
Okay. I just want to link up some of the issues. One, the issue of these phenomena of private military is a national security choice. And it must be guided by a national agenda. And I think this is very important. There's a point also mentioned about the military. What we have observed on the continent, there are two challenges. The militarization of politics and the politicization of the military. And this, they will continue to haunt Africa's stability. And I think this one to the issue of sovereignty. because security sovereignty is a responsibility. If a state fails to deliver the minimum functions of a state, then it becomes questionable. And I think what we have seen on the continent, the formation of a state itself is based on a outside-driven, in some countries, is cut and paste in institution to be looked as if we are a modern state. But in actual fact, we are not. And what we are seeing also is that we tend to forget what we have. And we start from something that is alien, not linked to our values and our culture. And for me, the sovereignty that is really built and based on our traditions and what led us to survive is extremely very important. I want to conclude with some work that we have done on the link between military spending and the security outcomes. We saw a very clear inverse relationship. The more you spend on military, the more actually the worse security outcomes. And it is because what is the security threat facing Africa now? Most of these security threats are internal. In fact, they are not external. And the army, yes, there's the issue of sovereignty. But let me conclude by following. In order to ensure this security's sovereignty, I want to come back to the fundamental question about the national agenda. And I think people talk about how can you leverage partnership. People talk about issue of national ownership. And I think one of the things we observe on the continent, we have made an assessment and we found most of the African countries, they don't have national security strategies. And if they have, the design, the way it was done without consulting the people. Because if you want to deliver security, it must be people-centered and people must be consulted. But we found also there's a very cumulative evidence to show, in fact, having a national security strategy can improve the delivery of security service. And I think that's why it is very important for us. What is good with national security is that it will help you collectively as a nation to articulate a vision, a security vision of the country, make a thorough security assessment, and have a very collective objective of how you can advance security. And I think that's why the link between, and this national security strategy can help you to make the nexus between security, development, and governance. And I want to echo the words of Kofi Annan, that humanity cannot enjoy development without security, and cannot enjoy security without development, and cannot enjoy both without the rule of law, that is governance. For me, this is the challenge for Africa in order to have your sovereignty around these three pillars, the nexus. And by the end of the day, I want to conclude also, such debate, it is very important for the issue of evidence-driven analysis of how to advance our security on the continent. Because the research is becoming very important. It is based on that research that you have a healthy dialogue between research and policy around how best you can advance the African security. And thank you.
Thank you very much. And my brother, I saved the best for last.
Thanks, David. And just my panelists have covered most of it, but you know, Madam Excellency asks a very provocative question, which really cuts to what we are discussing today. I think, of course, if you define sovereignty just by the book, you'll talk about a territory, population, and international recognition. But I think the problem of the African state is the lack of a social contract in many countries. And therefore, the legitimacy of the sovereign is always in question. You know, you are battling what we heard from Ambassador Kimani. You are in survival mode. And so you demand sovereignty, but you deliver very little to your public. We heard from a very eloquent intervention by our Malian colleague. And I remember a friend talking about going to Mali when it was described as a model democracy. And then they were puzzled in Bamako that not only does the state deliver very little to the people at that time actually assumed that they expected the state not to deliver. And that creates a very big problem. And so what we are seeing in the Sahel actually is a big challenge to the African state as we've known it. I think that the African state needs to have a social contract with its people and to deliver to the people if we are to avoid some of these problems. Just very quickly to the intervention about that this is not a black and white issue. I very much agree. I think that in some cases, you may buy space for internal reorganization, but unfortunately we don't really see that happening. And in the case of Sudan, I worry that you may have accidents that could cause a lot of problems, given the number of foreign operatives that we currently see. You'll remember in Syria, the Americans actually bombed a large number of Russians at some point in northern Syria. So it's a very delicate game, and we have to be really careful about it. Very quickly, one thing we've not covered, and Mr. Gao mentioned this, is AI. What will Africa's strategy be to AI? If you read all the literature, the Americans and the Chinese are essentially engaged in an arms race. All of them want to get to what they call artificial generative intelligence, which will have huge repercussions and implications in terms of how wars are fought, in terms of how intelligence is gathered, and we have to be really careful that Africa, is not caught unawares. I think the next very quick thing, we haven't really covered the power of individuals and corporations. Elon Musk is probably one of the most powerful individuals in the world. He has more satellites in orbit than the Russians, Chinese, and Americans combined. And so the power of individuals, the power of corporations, I think it's something we need to think about. And then, as our Nigerian friends say, finally, I think that we need to be alive that we are in a world between orders. And these moments can bring opportunity and they can also bring risk. What you need is agency beyond just rhetoric. You need Africans to have a position for Africa. Everybody has a strategy for Africa, but Africa needs to really carefully cultivate its own agency, think about what its position will be. We see Turkey, for example, showing very clearly what you can do with agency in a world of great power competition. There are opportunities, but as Gramsci said, it can also be a time of monsters. So we have to be careful. We make sure that we are not on the menu, and we cultivate a real African position to navigate a very tricky world we are living in.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. I believe they deserve a massive round of applause. Thank you very much for keeping everybody awake at this hour. And we look forward to the next sessions tomorrow. I'll hand back to the Master of Ceremonies. Thank you very much.
What a powerful way to end the day. Let's appreciate Siddiqui, General Siddiqui, Dr. Afzal, Dr. Luka, Muridi, and David. Let's appreciate them once again for a wonderful conversation. And can we appreciate ourselves for being a wonderful audience? Your Excellencies, thank you for sitting all through. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, we've come to the end of day one. I love the energy, and I hope that we can maintain that tomorrow. We will continue having those riveting, thought-provoking conversations. And I saw somebody tweet something about people coming for conferences. You see policymakers saying all the good things that they want for Africa. He asks, why does the momentum die? So I want that ISCA will change that narrative. We will, from now on, make sure what we discuss in these sessions will be implemented. We have a cocktail that kicks off at 7:30 here at KCC. So you're going to stretch your legs a little bit, go freshen up if you so wish.
If you want to spend some time at the exhibition area, please go do that. But then we are back at 7:30 for the gala dinner. The executive secretary has decided that we are going to unwind in that manner. And so you're invited to the gala, to the cocktail that starts at 7:30, and afterwards we will have the gala dinner. Tomorrow we start at 9, if we can get in here by the different places where the sessions will be happening. We will be in the auditorium and MH1. I'll give you more details later during the dinner. So let's go out a little bit, enjoy the next few minutes before we meet again, let loose and party. That's how we're going to end the day. Thank you so much.